All right, everybody, welcome back again. So good to be with you, as usual. And today we have just our next lecture in our course. We're continuing going through different arguments that try to establish that God exists. That's the point of the course that we're in now. We've already, surveyed a lot of the major world religious traditions, pretty much all of them, or at least the vast majority of them. And that's taken us now to this point where we're starting to examine arguments that have been written in history, which try to establish reasonable proof that God exists through some kind of argument. We've already reviewed two such arguments. So those were the ontological and the cosmological argument. And just very briefly, to summarize those, I'll spend less time on the ontological because that was a couple lectures back. But anyway, the ontological argument is based on an argument written by St. Anselm in 1077 AD, ACE. St. Anselm, a theologian, scholar, and then canonized as a saint after his life. So he wrote this book called the Proslogion in 1077, and in it there's the ontological argument. What it says is that everybody already kind of knows that the definition of God is the greatest conceivable being. And he says that's a common definition or understanding that all people have, whether they're believers or whether they're not believers. So that's the definition, greatest conceivable being, the being than which none greater can be conceived. From there, it just takes him a few steps to try and establish God's existence. He says, well, if something only existed in the mind, that wouldn't be as great as if it existed in both the mind and in reality. So since it's greater to exist in both, and God's defined as the greatest conceivable being, meaning the greatest thing you could even imagine or think of, then he will have to exist in both. Otherwise, that would be like saying the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest thing you could imagine, which would be a contradiction. So through that sort of reductio ad absurdum method, the author thinks he's proven that God exists. Again, why? Because he's defined as the greatest, and we have that idea of him. But part of being the greatest conceivable thing would be to exist not just only in the mind, but also reality too. So that's why he thinks God has to exist. That's not just an idea, but he's also real. And he continues by saying God cannot even be thought not to exist, because if he could be, that would also detract from how great he was. So God must exist in the mind and reality, and he cannot be thought not to exist. So he finishes by saying that atheists and non-believers, they must not really have idea of God in mind when they say that God doesn't exist. They must be referring to something else and using the same word. But anyway, he says it's not even possible to think that God doesn't exist. So whatever they're thinking, they must be thinking of something else. And then there was the cosmological argument. That was last class lecture. So that's, I find, a little more even personally satisfying argument. It begins by saying that, okay, so the author Richard Taylor, he's not the original author of the argument because the argument has a very long history going all the way back into ancient days. But this more updated version of it was written by the American philosopher Richard Taylor in 1963. So he starts by saying, imagine that you came across something really weird and unusual, like you're walking in the woods and you see just a random big sphere. That sticks out, that's out of place. So it would lead you to kind of become curious as to how it got there and what its cause was. And he uses that as his sort of test case to just sort of demonstrate that we usually will be curious about things that are sort of out of the ordinary and how they got there. But he notices that it's not just the unusual things that we could ask those kind of questions about. We could ask them about anything. Because everything that exists has to have a cause or an explanation, and that's the principle of sufficient reason. So that example and the discussion that follows it is to show the principle of sufficient reason. After that, he says, okay, well, there's different types of truths. Some are contingent, meaning they might not have happened, even though they are true. So it was possible for them to be false, at least. Then there are necessary truths, which are things that couldn't possibly be false. So for contingent truth, I don't know, just consider the fact that even you exist. I mean, you do exist, but had your parents not met or made a decision to have a child or, had the child, then you wouldn't have come out. So, there is a contingency there. Your existence is contingent on, dependent on something else happening. So it's something that might not have happened. On the other hand, there are necessary truths, which are things that are true on their own nature without any cause. So like 2 + 2 is 4 is necessarily true, meaning that it can't possibly be false. Oh, sorry. I don't know why I had this little yawn factor. I'm just kind of getting through my afternoon. It's been a busy morning. But anyway, yeah, so there you have it. Like there's contingent and necessary truths. Now, the contingent truths, the principle of sufficient reason pertains to them. And it says that if they might not have happened and they depend on something, then obviously there had to be a cause for those things. So he continues from there by pointing out that the universe exists. That's obviously true. And he thinks of it as a contingent truth because on all available accounts, it seems like it might not have happened if the Big Bang didn't happen or if creation didn't happen. So here we have a universe which exists. It's contingent. All the things inside of it are contingent, meaning that they're temporary, limited, finite. They have a beginning and an end. Things come into being and perish. So if that's true, then that the universe is contingent, the principle of sufficient reason says there has to be a cause or an explanation for it. So in his view, the only possible cause that could be for this universe, well, let's try out some options. It can't cause itself because a contingent thing cannot be its own cause because it would have to like already exist in order to serve as the cause. But we're asking the universe as an effect. What is the cause of that effect? It can't cause itself. Next, could it be that the universe is caused by something outside of it, but which is itself contingent? He says that option is also blocked because if it's caused by a contingent thing, then that thing's not the first thing, because if it's contingent, it's also dependent on a prior factor. So if we had a contingent cause of the universe, that would just lead to an infinite sequence of causes. That's known as an infinite regress, and it's thought to be impossible in philosophy. So it can't be caused by itself. It can't be caused by something contingent. So what's left? It has to be caused by a necessary being, something that's necessarily true, not just contingent. And that is basically God, the creator of the contingent universe and the cosmos. So everything depends on God, but God is independent. He doesn't depend on anything other than himself for his existence. So in that way, we get an explanation of what could be the cause of the universe. So the universe has to have a cause. It can't cause itself. It can't be caused by an infinite sequence of things that just goes back and back forever with no beginning. So he thinks it has to be caused ultimately by a necessary being, which is God. And along the way, he says, even if the universe had always existed, which he's not so sure about, but even if it had, he still thinks it would have to depend on a necessary being, because the two things could be co-eternal, both eternal, the universe and God, and yet they could still exist in this relationship where the universe is dependent on God and not the other way around. And I gave a few examples to make that point, like one example being the flame and the light. If the flame had always been burning, the light would be the effect of the flame, not the other way around, but they both would have been there forever. Or the giant in the sand, another type of example to make the same point. The footprint would be the effect. The giant standing in the sand would be the cause. Clearly, he causes the footprint, and the footprint doesn't cause him. But if he's always been there for eternity, then there would be an eternal time span over which he has been the cause and it has been the effect. So then we've come now to another important argument for God's existence. So let me just kind of talk to you about what it is and what it's called. Now we're going to be studying the argument from design. Design. It's the design argument. This argument from design, it's sometimes known by another name. It's sometimes called the teleological argument. So just because I want you to be aware of both names, I'll put that here. Okay, telos is the prefix of the word teleological. And from Greek, telos would refer to the reason for something or its purpose. So this is an argument that we can just simply label the argument from design. But what it's all focused on is that when something exists, if it has complexity and function within it, like it can do something or it can perform some kind of task, and it's also complicated in the way that it's arranged and put together so that it can do that task. Anything that seems like to have a purpose or function, the argument says it has to have come by a creative being. It had to have been caused by an intelligent designer. So since the ultimate conclusion of the argument will be that the universe or things inside the universe, let's be specific, there are things in the universe that exhibit a high degree of function, purpose, and internal complexity. And the argument says the only possible explanation for such things as that will have to be an intelligent designer. But if there's an intelligent designer that makes the things that we see in nature, then that would be God. So it basically tries to establish the existence of God by highlighting the fact that there are things in our world that are complex, functional, and that all the parts that allow them to perform their function have to be just so carefully arranged. So if that's true, the argument states that there must have been a intelligent being that created those things, and that's God in this example. Now, this argument has also got a pretty long history. It's been discussed by a variety of different writers over time. We're looking at one version of it that comes from this man. So his name is William Paley. William Paley, the name. He lived from 1743 until 1805. And the writing of his that I sent to you, it's just from 1800. So we're looking at the argument from design, the version of it written by William Paley in the year 1800, but you see his lifespan was from 1743 to 1805. William Paley was a British priest and also scholar and philosopher. So he had an important and impactful life. That's why we still look at his work today. Okay, so he begins the example, he begins the argument by giving a hypothetical scenario. And by now, since we talked about the cosmological argument, you're familiar with the idea that sometimes philosophers will use those things. They will talk about hypothetical scenarios in order to advance claims in an argument or to make points within an argument that help support the conclusion. So this is another example of a philosopher using that tactic. He's going to draw our attention to some, hypothetical concepts or scenarios to make us think about the features of his overall argument. So here's what he says to begin. He says, imagine that you're taking a walk. Again, it's just randomly that it's taking a walk in the woods. I don't want you to be confused into thinking that every philosophy hypothetical involves a walk in the woods, but just by coincidence. Taylor's example, you're finding a sphere in the woods. This guy has a different example of a person finding a thing in the woods, but it's not a sphere. Okay, so from William Paley's example, he says, suppose you're walking in the woods and you come across a watch. Okay, suppose you found a watch in the woods. So I'll put this all in our little chat here below in the typed out chat. Author example. Okay, so suppose you found a watch on the forest floor. So, you're just doing whatever in the woods, maybe hiking, camping, just chilling in nature. But you come across a watch. There's like a wristwatch that's seated there that's just on the ground, okay? So you found a watch like this watch that's on my wrist, okay? Just as an example. Now, if you found a watch, there's one thing I think that he points this out, and I'm sure we can all agree. There's one thing that you would know automatically about the watch, that this watch that you found, right, it had to have come from an intelligent being that created it. Why is that so obvious? Okay, so a watch is a thing that obviously it just cannot come from nowhere. It can't fall out of the sky. It can't, cause itself to be there. For a watch to exist, there had to be some kind of intelligent being that built the watch. Why? Why is that so self-evident? Well, it seems so obvious and clear that it had a creative designer, an intelligent designer, because it can tell time. It's a thing that's built for the function of telling time and keeping time. And notice this, that all the tiny little parts within the watch have to be just so carefully assembled so that it can achieve this function of time telling. So it's no way possible for a watch to have happened through a random, chaotic series of coincidences. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no way that a heavy wind could have blown through the countryside and just by chance it kicked up things into the air that somehow fused together and then a watch was there on the ground. There's no way that kind of process could have generated a watch, like, just random chance. It had to be some intentional act of creative design by a being that understood how to derive the raw materials and use them to produce this thing that tells time. So he thinks this watch example highlights a clear intuition that we should all be able to agree with. And I'll put it here in our chat. It's just this idea that um, if something has complexity, has function and purpose, and a complex arrangement of parts, then it had to have been created or caused by an intelligent designer. Okay, so point of the example. Okay, so I wrote here the sort of moral of the story, if you will, the point of the example, that if something has a function and a complex assembly of parts, like a watch, well, if that's true, then it would have to have been created by an intelligent designer. So that's just the first kind of like leg of the argument that we have to establish and get clear. Let me read a little of the words of the author from the pages that I distributed to you. And you can hear his kind of old-fashioned way of saying this. I mean, he's writing from the year 1800, so keep in mind, norms about the way of writing in English have changed significantly since then, but the basic content is here. So he starts off, let me say some narration before I start reading. In the first point, he says, well, suppose I just saw a random stone in the forest. That would not probably make me think too much. I might just assume it had always been there, for all I know. But if you saw a watch, now he contrasts it with the case of a watch. He says, okay, now that's different. If you saw a watch, though, unlike the stone, you would know that that specifically had to issue from an intelligent being that made it, because unlike the stone, it's got this ability to do something, the function of telling time, and it also has to be so carefully arranged and assembled so that it can be able to tell that time. So now I'll read his words and you'll hear him say it. He says, okay, on page, well, don't worry about the page, but the first page of the assigned reading for this, it says, in crossing a heath, okay, like going through a nature path, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and I was asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for all I know, to the contrary, it has been there forever, nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch on the ground, and it was asked how the watch happened to be in that place. I would never think of the answer that I gave before, that for all I know, the watch might have always been there. But why would this answer not work for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason, and for none other, namely that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day. So he's talking about how the watch serves this particular purpose and how it has to be just so perfectly assembled to do that. So he continues, if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, of a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. Then he goes into some description of the internal mechanics of watches and how they actually do function and how complex the assembly process has to be for a functioning watch to come to be. So, I mean, long story short, something as complex, functional, and intricately assembled as a watch could not have derived from anything other than an intelligent designer that built it with that goal in mind. Now, he's writing in the year 1800, and perhaps the reason that he uses a watch as his example is because at that time, a watch would have been perhaps one of the more, impressive objects that you could just point to that you might find in a random place that exhibit clear evidence of human creation. There wasn't as much technology that existed back then, but if this article had been written in 2023, he could have used any number of other examples that would have made the same point. Suppose you see a cell phone on the forest floor. Okay, well, you know that a thing like that can't happen unless it was built originally by some intelligent being that designed it and created the blueprint for how to put it together, because it can tell not just time, but it can take photos and it can do internet web browsing and it can, use apps and geolocation. So something that has got all that complex function and the ability to act according to those functions would also have to be created by an intelligent being. Or if you see I don't know, something as simple as just a pen, like a pen that writes. It's got the function of writing. It has to be put together just so that it achieves that function. If you saw that, you'd also know that it had to have an intelligent creator. And on and on. We could keep going, whether it's a pen, a computer, a car, a shoe, anything that you see that has a function that it serves and a specific kind of design aspect that allows it to do that given function, that thing, whether it be a watch or something else, must have had a creative, intelligent designer lying at the start or its origin. Okay, so we've got our point established now, I hope, clearly enough to your satisfaction. The author is trying to just make that basic point that when there's something like a watch that has that function, that has that complexity, you just already know that some kind of intelligent being had to get it started because it can't happen through random chance and it can't produce itself. Okay, now, he next makes another point. There's a series of 8 Roman numerals. You would notice those if you looked at the selected reading. And I just want to clarify what he means by these different points. As he raises these 8 Roman numerals, what he's talking about are things that would not cause you to doubt or deny that the watch had a maker. So like what are basically factors or things that even if you noticed this fact about the watch, it would not even cause you to stop to doubt. It would not cause you to doubt for even 1 second that the watch had a maker, an intelligent designer. So I'm going to list those here in our typed out chat. Factors that would not cause one to doubt or to deny that the watch had an intelligent designer. Just making sure that we're still all together here. I'm sorry if I lost a half second. I think there was a temporary internet outage for just a sec. But anyway, I didn't type anything yet, so we haven't missed anything. If there was anything lost, I'm just going to repeat myself. I was just pointing out that the next section of Paley's article, The Argument from Design, he just goes through a list of factors that he says would not cause anybody to significantly doubt that the watch had an intelligent designer or a maker. Okay, so here you see that comment in the chat. So again, it's factors that would not cause a person to doubt that the watch has an intelligent designer. What could these factors be? So he goes over 8 of them. I'm not going to talk about all 8 because I thought that some of them were more essential than others to the discussion and to the comprehension of his point. So let me just go through a few. Here's one of them. So one point is this. Suppose that you've never seen a watch being made. Okay. Now, if you're like me, you can probably relate to that because I personally have not actually seen a watch being made. I have bought a watch. I own a couple of different watches actually, but I've never witnessed with my own eyes the process of piecing a watch together. I know that you probably could see that if you really wanted to go find it. You could find some video on the internet of like how it's made and see the assembly line process in the watchmaker's shop. But most of us have probably never seen that. So whether you have or not, just suppose that you never saw a watch being made. Okay. Even if you had not seen a watch being made, you still wouldn't be doubting that the watch had a maker in the first place. You understand? Like, it's not that you have to see the creative process happening for you to understand that the end result is something that came originally from an intelligent being, right? And so there's a lot of things I have not seen being made. I haven't seen, a telescope being made, or I haven't seen a computer being made, but I know that they're so complex and that they're so, intricately assembled in order to do their task that they had to have come from an intelligent designer. So why is he making this point? He's trying to say that you don't really need to see the thing made to know it had a maker. All you have to know about it is that it has this function, this purpose, and this kind of complexity. Now, down the line, we're going to get to this in a moment, but you may be already anticipating where the argument's going. What he's going to say in the end is that there are also things that are not man-made that come out of nature, but that they also exhibit even greater levels of complexity and function. And so if we thought that the watch had to have a watchmaker, he's going to say the same thing about things we find within nature that also, are complex, functional, etc. And he'd say they have to have an intelligent designer too. And in that case, the intelligent designer is not a human being, but rather God. So, like, the watch is to the watchmaker as like the eye is to God, because the eye has a function, sight and vision, and it has to have all these intricately arranged biological components, rods and cones, retina, and so forth, optical nerves, in order for you to have vision. So he thinks that, if a camera could not exist without an intelligent being to cause the camera's existence, he argues the same must be true of, say, things in nature like the eye. But now we're talking about a creator of nature that's outside of it, like a supernatural being like God, and not just a human being, because human beings are not capable of instituting things that are natural, just, man-made or artificial things. So, but anyway, at the end of the day, somebody might say to him back, well, I don't know, I've never seen a creator God. I've never seen a supernatural being making anything. And since I haven't seen it, I'm not going to believe that it's true. But what he's pointing out here is that you wouldn't need to have seen any such act of creation if it was the case of a watch. You would simply be able to understand that whether you've seen the act of creation or not, you understand that it's made because it had to have, because it does have this complexity, this function, this purpose. So again, it's not a requirement to know that the watch has a maker to actually see it being made. Even if you haven't seen it being made, that would not cause you to doubt that it had an intelligent maker. Okay, another factor that he adds after that, we're still on the same point in our little typed out notes here about the factors and such that would not cause any doubt about the watch having a maker. So one is that you hadn't seen it being made. That would not cause any doubt. Another one is this. Suppose that the watch has a flaw. Okay, so suppose you stumble upon this watch that we've referred to, and it's just not in proper working order. It's broken. It's not telling time correctly. Maybe the pointer hand of the second counter just keeps ticking back and forth, so it's not really able to tell its time. Okay, well, look, even though there might be a flaw in the watch that you're finding, and it's not correctly working, that also would not cause any significant doubt that it had a creator either, because even a broken watch is still something that strikes us as obviously having been created with the intent of it telling time, even if it happens to be a defective or broken copy. In the same way, if you see a car that's out of service because it's just broken down in the junkyard, that wouldn't make you think, well, I don't know about this car. Maybe this car just happened through random chance because it's not a properly working car. So even a broken watch is something that had an intelligent designer. It's not so much whether it's working properly, but rather whether it has the intended hallmarks of design that ordinarily allow it to properly function. And why is he making this point? Well, again, when we get to his analogy that there are things in nature that also exhibit function and complexity, like, say, the eye, a critic might push back by saying, well, hey, some people are born blind, though, right? Or some people are born with, like, not a properly functioning heart or lung. And if those things aren't working correctly, then how can we attribute it to a creative act of an intelligent designer? But what he's saying here is, in the analogy that we're looking at, a watch that was not properly working would still obviously had to have been created by an intelligent being. And so the same could be told of things that are natural that don't work properly. Yes, occasionally, although it's the exception rather than the norm, occasionally there may be a malfunctioning eye that doesn't have proper vision or any vision at all. But if you look at the eye itself, even the defective one, let's call it, it would still have the same kind of basic physiological structure that ordinarily allows eyes to have sight. So 2 points. If you have never seen a watch being made, it's like, so what? You still know it had a creator. If it had a flaw, also, that would not lead to any doubt that it had a creator and an intelligent one. What about another point? Suppose that you don't fully understand how the watch works. Okay, so you come across this watch and you just don't know how it's working. It works, but let's suppose you just have no idea how it works. It's telling time, but you're like, what's going on under the hood, as it were, of this thing? I have no idea how it functions. It's functioning, but you just don't know how. Now, again, what he's saying about that is, even if you're not aware of the way that the watch works, just the very fact that it exists and it has this function and this kind of complexity, that's enough information to know that it had an intelligent designer, even if you're not currently aware of the details of how it actually works. Um, to use the same example, I mean, I have this watch. This is a kind of nice Garmin watch. It's one of the sports fitness tracking watches. It's one of their higher end ones, the Phoenix 6X Solar Pro. Okay. And it does a lot of interesting functions. Like it's always tracking my heart rate and it keeps track of my sleep. And if I do a running activity or any other kind of sports activity, it's going to give me all this data about like my pace and my cadence and, on and on and on. So there's a lot of function that this watch does possess, but I don't understand how it does all those things. I mean, I'm not like an engineer or a specialist in electronics. So I don't even have a very clear idea at all of how it does those things. I just buy the watch and I know that it works. But here's the thing, I don't need to know how it works for me to understand that something so complicated and functional had to start with an intelligent being that created it. I mean, a lot of us don't understand a lot of things. We use computers and smartphones and microwave ovens, and we understand that they work, but we don't always understand the details behind the technical aspects of how they do their thing. Even if it was a car, I mean, I know basically that there's an internal combustion engine. Well, in a traditional car, of course, you also have the hybrids and other kind of cars, but electric cars, etc. But at the same time, even though they work, I'm not an automotive specialist, so I could not tell you really what's going on under the hood. I just use the thing. But again, I hope the point is coming clearly through to you that even if we're not aware of the function of how the function occurs, we would know just on the mere basis that it does perform that task and that it has a complicated assembly that allows it to do it. That's enough to know that it still had an intelligent creator. So back to the analogy that we're going to ultimately end with, which is that there are things in nature that have function and purpose. So he thinks they're made by a creator that's God. When it comes to the things that are in nature, sometimes we don't know how they work, like the human brain or the brain of just any life form. We know that it has something to do with their cognitive functioning and their perception of things. And, there's all these centers in the brain that are responsible for motor control and perception and other things. But a lot about the brain is not understood, not even by like the most advanced neuroscientists. So the fact that we don't know how it works, does that mean that we're going to say maybe it's got no intelligent designer? He doesn't think so. He thinks that just on the basis that something has function, complexity, and purpose, that's enough to know it had an intelligent designer. That's enough to know a watch has an intelligent designer. And whether you've seen one being made, whether it has any flaws, even if you don't know how it works, none of those things diminishes the certainty that you have that it had to have an intelligent designer. So in the case of, like, say, an eye, if it was blind, or if you've never seen one made by a supernatural being, or you're not aware of how the eye functions, it's enough to know that it does have that function in a typical case, and all its complexity allows it to do so. That would be enough to know it had an intelligent maker too. And then one more point, nobody would think that the watch came about through random chance, right? So nobody would say that a better explanation for the watch's existence is just chance and luck. Nobody would say, I don't think it had been made by an intelligent being. I think that just somehow metal and rubber and silica just somehow came together like chemicals in nature and by chance generated a watch. We talked sort of about that briefly earlier, but nobody would take that to be a viable hypothesis as to the origins of the watch, because it takes a guiding hand. It takes an architect with some intention to finally assemble all these pieces so that they do form a watch. So here are 4 points to make. It's like the whole point of this little sidebar is that everyone knows the watch has a maker that's intelligent. Why? Because it's complex, functional, and it tells time. And there's no good reason to doubt that. He's saying you would never doubt the watch had a maker, even if you didn't see one ever being made, even if the watch you're looking at was not functioning well, even if you're not aware of how that one watch works. And of course, it would not be a better alternative explanation for it to say that it came about through just chance, coincidental events with no kind of intentional or intelligent being behind it. So with all of that, now we get to the analogy, and that's the third little section of the writing that I assigned to you. And this is where it's all building up towards. So what he says is that there are also things in nature and in the world that are like the watch, but they're not made by any human. And what he means is stuff like, say, the eye. Okay, so let's consider the eye. The eye also has a function. The function is vision. And it's a very impressive function, isn't it? I mean, if you're watching this video, then you already understand that vision is pretty amazing. You get to see things just in your environment. These eyes are what provide us with that ability, together with the function of the brain. Now, the eye is a thing that can see, and that's its purpose and function. And all of the myriad little biological components that were briefly referred to earlier, the rods, the cones, the optical nerve, the retina, they have to be just so finely combined and assembled so that vision can take place. So if we thought that a watch had to have a watchmaker, or a camera had to have a camera maker, then he's prepared to say that therefore also a thing like the eye would have to have an eye maker. But who or what could possibly be the creative or intelligent designer behind something that's not man-made, but rather issued by nature? And he thinks that has to be a being that stands outside of nature, that can act as the author of these intentionally produced functional things, and that would have to be God. Okay, so God is the watchmaker, so to speak, that stands behind the origin of anything in nature that has a function. He highlights the example of the eye, but it would generalize to any other natural thing that also had a specific detailed function. So the tongue can taste, the ear can hear, the nose can smell, the wings of the bird can fly, the sonar of the bat can allow it to navigate or echolocate, and so on and so on. So all of these life forms and objects that the life forms possess, like the eye or the other sense organs, they all have detailed and particular functions, and they also have highly detailed and specialized assembly of biological parts in order for them to perform their function. There's also, the respiratory system, the respiration cycle of weather, photosynthesis of plants. These things all achieve a function for the being that has it. And in his view, that function, that complex purpose, would have to be explainable only on the assumption that there was an intelligent designer that did it. Because just as with the watch, which can't happen through random or spontaneous unconscious processes, he thinks that even more so, we couldn't see any kind of development of the eye or etc., unless that was done by an intentional creator. So let me read some of the words on the eye stuff, and then you'll hear how he kind of puts this analogy. He says, every indication of design, every manifestation of intent which exists in the watch exists also in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater and more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. Let me pause and explain something there. He says, if you think about it, not only does nature also have things that are, functional, complex, purposive, like the watch, but that the things that nature generates, or the things that are in nature, they're perhaps even more impressive from the standpoint of what they can do and what their function is. A camera is pretty cool, but it's not at all as cool as the eye, which would be by all accounts sharper and more detailed. I mean, certainly some people's vision is not amazing. We've talked about this, the case of the watch with a flaw, but at any rate, the human brain is probably much more impressive than any currently existing computer. The eye more impressive than any currently existing camera. So what he's saying is the same logic that tells you that the watch has a maker should tell you even more strongly that the things that are in nature, which have these functions and purposes, have to have a maker, because their function, purpose, and so forth, it's even more impressive and detailed. So he continues. He says, I mean that the design of nature surpasses the design of art in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of the mechanism. And still more, if possible, do they go beyond them in number and variety. Yet, in a multitude of cases, they're not less evidently mechanical, not less evidently designed, not less evidently accommodated to their end or suited to their office than the most perfect productions of human ingenuity. I know no better method of introducing so large a subject than that of comparing a single thing with a single thing. An eye, for example, with a telescope. So he compares the eye with the telescope made to assist vision, the eye, he would say, made to, conduct vision itself. So he says, as far as the examination of the instrument goes, there is precisely the same proof that the eye was made for vision as there is that the telescope was made for assisting it. They're both made upon the same principles, both being adjusted to the laws by which the transmission and reflection of rays of light are regulated. I speak not of the origin of the laws themselves, but such laws being fixed. The construction in both cases is adapted to them. For instance, these laws require, in order to produce the same effect, that the rays of light, in passing from water into the eye, should be refracted by a more convex surface than when it passes out of air into the eye. Accordingly, we find that the eye of the fish, in that part of it called the crystalline lens, is much rounder than the eye of terrestrial mammals. So he's talking about the subtle differences in the construction of the eye when you look at aquatic life forms versus terrestrial, like earthbound, on the surface of the earth life forms. And he says, doesn't that show that there had to be some kind of adjustment of the design in order to achieve the same function for these different environments? So he says, what plainer evidence of design could there be than this difference? What more could a mathematical instrument maker have done to show his knowledge of his principle, his application of that knowledge, his suiting of his means to his end? I will not say to display the compass or excellence of his skill in art, because in these matters all comparison is not good enough. So that's really it. That's his argument here. And let me just kind of summarize the major elements of it. Beneath the discussion, it's somewhat simple, I believe. It's just that where there's something with purpose, complexity, and function, it has to be created by an intelligent being. He uses the watch as his sort of test example of that intuition. He says, in coming across a watch, you would be able to think about it for just a moment and understand that it generated originally from an intelligent being because it tells time and because all the parts that allow it to tell time are so finely and intricately assembled. So the point he takes away is that if something has a purpose, function, and a complex assembly of parts, it has to have an intelligent designer, like, for example, the watch. He then says, by the way, there's no legitimate reason to deny that the watch has a maker, even if you'd never seen one made yourself, even if it wasn't properly working, even if you didn't know how it worked, and even if you had some idea that maybe some other process could have generated it. None of those other ideas would legitimately detract from the clear idea that it has to have an intelligent maker. It would still have to have an intelligent maker, regardless of whether any of these other things were seen or noticed about it. So finally, he says, what about things that are not made by man, but like by nature? We see that there's, the fins of a fish, the wings of a bird, the eyes of a human being, or the digestive system, circulatory system. These things all have function and purpose and complexity. And in his view, that's not a random thing. That's not something that can just happen by unguided, unconscious events, somehow, spontaneously leading to those outcomes. He believes that just as a watch could only result from a watchmaker's intentional act of creation, so also the eye could only result from God's intentional act of creation, trying to institute something that was capable of the function of vision from his supernatural position outside of space and time. So we've seen now 3 arguments for God's existence, each one with a slightly different point of emphasis. There was the ontological argument by Anselm, which said that the definition of God is enough to prove that he exists because he's defined as the greatest conceivable being. And to him, that carries with it these other logical consequences. The greatest conceivable being, part of that greatness would be to exist in reality and not just the mind. Then we saw Richard Taylor, and he said that the basic force of his argument is that everything has a cause. So since the universe exists, it has to have a cause. And as he argues, the only possible cause that it could have would be something that's separate from it, but something also that's not contingent, because a contingent thing would never be the first cause. So there must be a necessary being that causes the contingent universe, and that's just God. And now we've taken another look at one more big argument for God's existence. That's this one, the argument from design, or some call it the teleological argument. And its point of emphasis is that things that have function and complexity have to have a creation that lies with a creative architect, an intelligent designer. The hypothetical that he uses to make the point is that there's a watch someone finds in the forest. He thinks that you could relate to that and understand that it would immediately be clear to you that the watch had an intelligent creator at its origin. There's no way a watch could have come about in any other way. It's just too subtle and complex in its construction, allowing it to tell time. You don't need to know how it works. It doesn't need to perfectly work. It doesn't mean that you had to have seen it made, because regardless of whether those things are true or not, you'd know that it had a creative designer. Now, at the end, he just connects the example of the watch to the example of things that are in nature, like the eye. And he says, since they also exhibit a parallel or even greater level of function, complexity, and purpose, they also must be traced back to an intelligent being that created them. It's just as ridiculous, he thinks, to say that the watch could come about through just random events as to say that the eye could come about through random events. They're just the end product is just too specific in its function and complex in the arrangement of its given parts for that to be a process that took place without any kind of intention of an intelligent being behind it. Now, there are different arguments, but these are really, I think, some of the big three for, arguments given for theism: the ontological, cosmological, and teleological arguments. Many people think of them as like a trio of major arguments that have been used throughout history to try and give a case for God's existence. Some people like one more than the other. I think I've kind of tried to intimate that I like the cosmological argument the best of the three, but they all have their own interesting, appeal, and depending on a person's own judgment and feeling, you might find greater favor with one than the other. But there's also room to find doubt with all of them. There's objections to each one that we will ultimately talk about. That's 2 lectures ahead of us. So we have one more lesson after this that talks about Pascal's wager. That is a classical argument that tries to establish that it's the best thing for you to do is to believe in God, even if we can't prove that he exists. So it's a slightly different angle, but again, it is trying to establish that the right choice is to believe in God. That's Pascal's wager. That's next time. And then after that, the last recorded lecture that I will give to you is about a criticism of all these different arguments. So we want to kind of have some balance, hear from both sides. So we will at least briefly consider arguments to the contrary, objections against these different views. So we will learn about what people have said in criticism of the ontological argument, the cosmological, the design argument, and even Pascal's wager. So we'll learn about the objections, we'll teach the debate, and we'll learn about how both sides argue. And then it's really up to you to determine on your own whether you thought some of these arguments had merit, whether you thought the objections were better, how you think they connect to the larger issue of like religion and world religions. So that's about it. I knew that the design argument might not occupy our full typical time slot of an hour to an hour and 15, but that's okay to get you a little bit of free time back. So please, though, continue reading and studying the notes that I've distributed to you. I'm going to make available the study guide for the final later in the week, and I'm currently working on grading the papers that you've all submitted. I'll have those grades ready by the end of this week, and I'll post to each student individually their score and comments by the end of the day on Sunday. So you'll have those back with you, by the end of this week, and then we'll turn our focus towards getting ready for the final. But we just have a couple more lectures to review. So keep reading the notes that I sent to you and the texts that I sent to you on Canvas. You'll see those announcements posted. For now, though, wishing you guys are all having a great day and a good week. And again, if you ever need me for anything, please email me and I'm available, or contact me through Canvas inbox, and I can also check messages that way. But for the time being, okay, guys, let's just adjourn for now. Thanks again for being here for World Religions, and I'll see you all soon. Okay, bye-bye.